Okay, that's started. Okay, great. Yeah, so today we're going to be working through this assignment for Mongo 1. If you have any questions, again, just feel free to stop me at any point in time. This assignment was sort of like just we left you with no starter files at all, and you sort of had to go about creating them yourselves. Honestly, I would have preferred to have starter files here. I guess we just didn't end up creating them for this. So I'm going to go ahead and do it. I'm going to go ahead and explain how you would do this from scratch for the most part, except I'm basically going to use another repository as reference. Sorry, I just want to say something. Are there any issues?
Nope, all good.
Okay, cool. All right, so what I'm going to do, it's always good if you're starting from scratch. I would just recommend looking at like a previous mini project or a previous lab just to see how we set up the directory structure. You'll see for Mongo 1 Mini, which you guys did earlier, we have this package.json. That's probably the first part where we have all the different packages that we need, and for the most part, we're going to need every single one of these packages for this, this task. We're going to need Mongoose. We're going to need Express. This ESLint stuff is for the linter, so that's why that's here. And we need body parser to parse out post JSON bodies. What I'm going to do is I've already done this actually. I've just copied and pasted this exact package.json file within my directory. So you'll see I have this package.json, which I just copied and pasted that exactly. This just sets up the set of dependencies. You can manually install the dependencies yourself, but it's nice to have it in a package.json file so that, if you were to send this directory to someone in some way, or if they were to clone your repository or your fork, they can just run npm install and they would install all of these packages immediately. The package.json just outlines every single package that this particular project needs. So I'll go ahead and run npm I. I've already done this, so it should just take a second. Yeah, so I have my node modules directory with all my packages inside there. Let me increase the font size here so it's a little easier to see. I also have an empty server.js file, so we're just going to be starting from scratch here, and we'll start working now. So let's just look at what the instructions say. So the instructions say, download MongoDB. You guys should have done that already. Create a new folder and run npm init to create your package.json file. Okay, so they're just telling you how to do it from scratch. Implement the following routes. Okay, post/users, this route should save a new user to the server. Get/users, return an array of all users. So basically what we have post, get, and delete, right? So this right here is mostly just, as you can see, it's just performing create, read, and delete operations on a user's model, right? So we're going to have a set of users, and we're going to want to perform different operations on that set of users. Okay, so what's one of the first things that we should set up for our server? There's probably two things that we really need to do to start off. Imports, yeah, absolutely. So we'll have to write some imports in, but just a little bit of a higher level. What are the main things that we'll have to work on? There are two main things that we'll have to implement. Yeah, so sort of the Express side, which is the actual routes, right? So this is actually handling these routes right here and doing something in return. I don't think everyone's mic is muted, so if you could just double check that for yourself, that would be great. But these so we have to actually handle these routes. And the second thing that we have to do is actually set up the schema, right? So as Latoya and Patrick said, and John said, we have to set up the schema for users so that we have a model that we can use to interface with MongoDB. I'm just going to go ahead.
Can I pause you here? There is if you click on participants in the bottom left-hand corner, you should see a mute all button.
Yeah, I just did that. Yep, cool. That sounds good. Okay, yeah, sounds a lot better now. Okay, great. So. Okay, so right, so let's go ahead and get started on those two things. The first thing I'm going to do is going to set up the server because I already created this empty server.js file. So we'll set up a server, we'll set up a simple route in that server, and then we'll make a request to that route and just make sure that our server works before we get started on the actual user's implementation, right? So the first thing we have to do is always require Express, right? Because that's what we're going to be using. So require Express. We now have Express ready to use. We need to create our server, which is simply just calling Express, okay? Just calling Express. Express is a function that returns a server. So we call it with no arguments. We get back a server. And now that we have the server, we have to make sure that our server can parse out JSON bodies in post request, input request, delete request, etc. So for that, we need to use the body parser. Remember, the entire point of the body parser is if a client sends up some JSON data in a post body or in a put body or in a delete body, we want to be able to parse that and understand the parameters within it. So for that, we need the body parser, right? So the body parser is another library. I have to require body parser. And then I have to make my server use it. So server.use bodyparser.json. So this is basically saying, hey, server, use the body parser's JSON parser to parse post bodies. Okay, so now our server can understand post bodies, JSON post bodies from requests, and we can get those parameters. And inside our code, whenever we do like rec.body.some parameter, that's what this line is allowing us to do. Okay. Great. So now that we have our server, let's go ahead and just like test that out real quick. So server.get/, right? So just like a very simple test route for now. And then let's just go ahead and send back some JSON response. Maybe I'll send back hello, and then the value is going to be world. Okay. So now that we have that, let's go ahead and test that. So this is the same directory on the right-hand side here. Let me go ahead and just increase the size. And now what I'm going to do is run nodemon server.js, right? So you'll notice a few things. So first off, it said clean exit, waiting for changes before restart. So what this means is that our script just exited. Okay, so that's a bad sign, because when we're writing a server, we want the server to stay running. It basically should run forever, or as long as we keep it running, because we want it to accept requests from the client, and those requests will come in at any time, right? The server is just going to be sitting there listening, for a really long time until we Control-C out of it, or until that it runs into some error. So the reason it said clean exit is because we forgot to do something. What did we forget to do? Yeah, so Eli said it. So the server's actually not listening, right? Remember, we always have to tell the server to listen on some port. And again, a port number is just like, you can think of it sort of as an address of where this server is running. It's just going to be running on this port number. And the reason we have port numbers is so we can run multiple servers on the same machine, right? So I could run, one server on port 3000, one server on port 8000, and that's totally fine, right? So port number is just an abstraction to let us sort of have an address for a server. It just gives us a way to run multiple servers on the same machine. So server.listen 3000. Okay, I'm just going to listen on port 3000. Nodemon's going to restart it, and notice this time it says starting node server.js, and now nothing actually pops up, right? So this means that it's just running right now. Okay, there's no clean exit, right? It's just running. So that's great. So let's go ahead and test that. So I'm going to open up Postman. Hopefully all of you can see this. I'm going to type in localhost 3000, and then we'll go ahead and hit send, and you'll see hello world. Perfect. Okay. So hopefully you guys can all read this, but localhost 3000 send hello world, exactly what we wanted. Cool. So we got our server set up. Any questions about how we set that up before I move on?
Just at the top of the, like when you're doing those requires, we're pretty much doing the same thing like we were in React with the import, right? Is it just a different naming convention?
Yeah, so import is like the new way of importing things. It's sort of like the next standard for writing imports. Require is like sort of the old standard. The thing about it though is it's not particularly old necessarily. Like Node.js basically only still supports require. So require is still very much like a regular way to do things. It's just, they're just two alternate syntaxes. Just like in ES6 where you saw a lot of alternatives, you see a lot of shorthand for doing the same thing. You can sort of think of it in the same way where require and import are the same thing in two different ways.
Cool. Got it. Thank you.
Yep. All right, cool. I'm going to go ahead and move on, but let me know if you guys have any questions about that going forward. Okay, so now we have our server.js file. We also need to set up our schema. I personally, the way that I like to do this is I'm going to introduce a new file that will represent the schema, in this case, for our users, right? So I'm just going to call that user.js, okay? And I'm going to open that up. And inside user.js, what I want to do is set up the Mongo schema, right? And so we can go ahead and look at Mongo I Mini again for some information about that. It's actually inside the models.js file. We'll sort of see exactly how we set up the bare schema, right? So I'm going to go ahead, or the bare schema. I'm going to go ahead and put this in right here. Get rid of this I. Okay, so basically we have to require Mongoose. Then we're going to define our schema. Then we're going to export out a model. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this comment. You guys know what a schema is already. I'm going to define a user schema, right? So I want the schema to represent a user, and then I'm going to go ahead and export out a model. So actually, normally this first argument should be a singular name for the type of object, a singular capitalized name. So it should be just user in this case. Ryan will talk a little bit more about this during the lecture today. But yeah, so basically, just to recap, this is the schema, which is like, just a description of the format of each user object. So it'll tell us what are the keys of the user object, along with what are the types associated with each key in the user object. And the model is a way for us to interface with the user collection. Okay, so once we export out this model in other files, we can get a reference to that model and then start performing different actions on it. So we can call .find, or we can call .find by ID, or we can call .delete, right? So there's like a lot of different functions that we can use to go ahead and create, read, update, delete users. Okay, so how do we define the schema? Well, we have to think about what do we want each user to have. And from the instructions, there's actually like no details about this. It basically just leaves it up to you to sort of define what a user looks like for yourself, for your specific application. I'm going to go ahead and make it pretty simple. I'm going to give a user is going to have, I'll just say that a user has a username, okay, which is going to be a string, type string, and it also has an email address. Well, actually, never mind. Let's actually do two different types. So let me do a username, and then let me do an age, I guess. Okay, so type number. Okay, so my users will have usernames and ages, right? There could be a lot of other fields you have in here, maybe like a name, like a regular name, not a username, things like that. So this is how I'm defining my schema. So again, the username key, of course, is a string. The age key is a number. A bit of a shorthand for this, instead of doing type string, if the only thing in your object on the right-hand side right here is type string, you can get rid of it and just write string like this, and this will work fine. The object is useful if you want to add in extra options like required, true. Okay, I'm not going to go over all the different options. In fact, Ryan is going to talk about them a little bit more during the lecture. So instead, I'm just going to use the shorthand for now because we don't really need those other options. Okay. So it'll look like that. We might actually come revisit this a little bit later if we have some time. But we have username and age. Username is a string, age is a number. Does that make sense to everyone? Any questions about that so far? All right, one other thing that I want to mention about this, I'll also keep monitoring, but one other thing I want to mention is that the thing is, we also need to make sure we set up Mongoose. So we actually have Mongoose connect to our database, okay? The way that we have Mongoose connect to our database is to call mongoose.connect. So we have to call .connect, and then we pass it in a URL representing sort of the location of our database. So just like, google.com is a URL representing, Google's website, we can pass it in a MongoDB URL that represents, hey, where is MongoDB listening for connections? Okay, so we basically say MongoDB // this is the protocol. Just like you have HTTP, that's the HTTP protocol. This is the MongoDB protocol. Localhost means, hey, Mongo is running on our machine. Okay, and then I have to specify a path, and the path will be sort of the name of the database. So I'm going to decide to call this, users DB. Okay, so this is going to be the users database. That's why I'm calling it users DB. I can use whatever name I want right here. Doesn't really have to correspond to anything. Doesn't have to be the same as this name in any way. Can just be whatever it wants. Okay, and then we always pass the second argument, use Mongo client true, and that just uses the latest. That just uses the latest Mongoose client. So this is sort of the updated client that's better and that's faster. So that's why we added this option right here. A few notes here, like you can also specify a port. So Mongo usually runs on port 27017. That's just the port number that they chose to run on. You can add the port explicitly here, but if you don't specify it, it assumes that it's the default port. So that's why I'm not specifying it. Remember, in order to specify a port, it's always the host name, which in this case is just localhost our machine, followed by the port number, okay, 27017. So this is saying, hey, look for Mongo running on our machine on port 27017. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, that's looking good for now. Okay, great. So now that we have that, what we want to do is go ahead and run Mongo, right? So far, I'm just running NodeMon. I need to run Mongo. So how do I run Mongo? Let me just do it down here. So let me just go ahead and open up the same directory. This is the finished. It's like ls mongo unfinished. Here we go. Okay. So what I'm going to do is run Mongo. So the way I personally like to run Mongo, there were a few different ways of doing this. Ryan showed you a way where you add in like a /data/db directory, and then you run mongo d. The problem with that is that one disadvantage of that, it's not like wrong, but one disadvantage of that is that it's sort of a global Mongo instance across your computer. So if you have multiple projects and those projects, each sort of do their own thing with Mongo, if any of the names conflict, like if the database name is the same or if the table name is the same, you might run into some problems where you're sort of stepping on each other with your different applications. One way to avoid that is to have like a different sort of directory for all of the Mongo data. So in other words, you're sort of running a clean Mongo instance, instance for each individual project, right? And all of your data for that project is stored in a specific project directory. So that's why I personally like to introduce this extra directory. It's just a way to sort of isolate the different projects. So I'm going to do mkdir data. So that's just going to create a data directory right inside here. Okay, and then I'm just going to run mongo d. Right, mongo d. Mongo d stands for Mongo daemon. It's the background process that runs Mongo. Whenever you see d at the end of a command, it usually means daemon or background process. I mean, granted, this is going to be running in the foreground, so I'll explain that in just a minute. But mongo d, mongo daemon. So it's actually, just to be clear, the d stands for daemon, which is daemon. I believe the correct pronunciation of this is actually daemon, but every time I see it, I just have to say daemon because, I don't know, I've just always pronounced it that way. Maybe I should correct myself, but if you hear me say daemon, it's this word right here. It's actually technically pronounced demon, but I'm just going to say it that way. I'm just so used to saying it that way. Okay, so mongo d. Okay, so mongo d, and then what we're going to do is pass db path data. So db path is sort of like the directory that contains all the data, and that's going to be the local data directory. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. Notice it spits out a bunch of information and says waiting for connections on port 27017, right? So this is the port I was talking about. This is the default port that Mongo runs on. So that looks solid. And you'll notice that this is still running. So it's running in the foreground right here. It's just waiting for connections. Generally, if you had Mongo running on some computer, you would just run it in the background. You wouldn't keep a terminal open. You just have it running as a process in the background, and then that would always handle connections. That way you don't really need to keep a terminal open, but that's like a minor issue. You don't have to worry about that too much. Okay, so now let's go ahead and check if this works. So a good way to check if this works is let's just do something really, really simple, right? So let's go into server.js, right? So I'll keep the user.js open, that's up here, and then server.js starts down here. So I'm gonna go ahead and require that. So I can do const user is equal to require ./user.js, right? So that's going to require this user.js file up here and give me back this model, this user model. And then in slash, now we can make this /users. When you get /users, I want to return all the users, right? So how do I find all the users? Furiously taking tools. Yeah. So yeah, I mean it's the same daemon as in daemon tools. Yeah. So this MongoDB localhost command creates the DB. Yeah. So Mongoose sort of implicitly creates the DB if the DB doesn't exist. So again, the question is, how do I get the entire, an entire array of users? So all the users in the database. Yeah, so find an empty object, right? So let me explain that real quick. It's user.find followed by empty object, okay? And then the callback will accept two parameters in this case, error and the actual array of users. Okay, so find is basically saying, hey, find all users that match some condition. In this case, the conditions are described by objects, right? And Ryan's going to go over this a lot more in his lecture, but he'll show you ways to craft like different types of conditions. Basically, we could say hypothetically, like, find all users where the username is Karthik, right? Like, this would give me back an array of users where the username matches Karthik. Okay, so this is an example of a find query. Right now I want to find all users, so I just pass in an empty object because basically all users will match an empty object. There is no condition, it's just giving me back all users. Okay, so that's what this means. The second parameter is, in this case for find, is a callback that will be called once we found the users. It gets back an error and it gets back the actual array of users. Okay, so if there's an error, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and send that error back to the client. Okay, various ways of doing this. So for simplicity, basically what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and send back this error, right? So we're going to set the status equal to status user error. Okay, and then we're going to go ahead and send the JSON of users back down. Okay, so, and then of course status user error is 422, right? So that's a special status code for, hey, there's a semantic error with this request. So if we couldn't find the users for some reason, we're going to send back status user error, and then we're going to go ahead and send back an array of users back to the client as a JSON response. Okay, or sorry, not an array of users. Sorry, we're going to send back the error. My bad. Of course, this is the error handling case, right? So we're going to send back the error to the user. Okay. Okay, cool. It just so happens that Mongoose gives us some nice errors right here that we can use. That when we call res.json on, well, they'll appear really nice in Postman, so we can see exactly what the error is. In this case, there should really be no error right here. We're just accessing all the users. But it's good to have this in case, like hypothetically, like Mongo wasn't running or there was some issue when we're actually saving. And I'll explain a case where this is actually more important in a little bit. Make a call to /users. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, we should be sending back there. Yeah. You can use else here. That's totally fine. I'll go ahead and use it here as well. So we can do res. So now we want to send back the users. So we can just do res.json of users, right? So otherwise, if there is no error, we just send back the set of users. Does that make sense to everyone? Any questions about that first route? Looks like some people are typing. I just want to go ahead and test this real quick while they're typing. So localhost 3000 /users. Let's go ahead and send. Cool, we get back an empty array. So that's a great sign. That basically means, we successfully connected to Mongo. We made a request to Mongo. We got back an empty array of users because no users have been created yet. So that's an excellent sign. And we'll confirm again that Mongo is correctly working once we implement the post route, which will actually retrieve out, or which will actually create a new user. We'll be going into Damon's more. The syllabus had it listed for this sprint, but I didn't really come across it anywhere. I don't know for sure. I would need to double check the syllabus. But I mean, for the most part, like it's not too different, right? Like it's the idea that you guys are writing programs right now. Certain programs are long running processes because they're servers, or they are databases, or they're doing something that just needs to happen in the background a lot. Like you can think of a lot of such things. Like maybe there's something that's like sort of collecting analytics in the background. Maybe there's something that's waiting for requests. Maybe there is, your operating system has a ton of processes in the background that's making sure everything is running well and allowing you to switch between applications, things like that. So Daemon isn't particularly different from any other program. It's just the idea that it's a program that's sort of always running in the background. That's the only main thing there. How come you don't have to return after sending the error to stop the code from running? Okay, so the thing about the error case is that the thing you need to watch out for is sending a response twice. You want to make sure you don't send a response twice. Now, if the code continues to execute, that's fine, given the fact that it doesn't send a second response, right? So that's why I have this else statement here. I'm basically saying, hey, if there's an error, send back that error. Otherwise, send back the array of users. If it were to enter this if body, after the JavaScript engine enters this if body, it's then going to just exit out. It's going to exit out of user.find, then it's going to exit out of user.get, right? Or sorry, it's not going to exit out of user.get because it's just going to exit out of this function right here, right? Because that's the function it's contained in. This function is going to be called sometime later, right? Server.get, the callback to server.get is going to call user.find, and then at some point in the future, when user.find is done, it's going to call this callback right here. And then we're basically just going to enter this if statement, and then it's just going to return out of that if statement and then return out of this callback function. Okay, so basically, I'm just making sure that I'm not sending two responses. That's the key. It's not about continuing to execute code. You can continue to execute code if you want. But what you can't do and what you shouldn't do is send two responses, because that's confusing to the client. That doesn't make any sense. So if there's something on line 18, yeah, well, I mean, so it depends on what you're doing, right? Like one of the things that you might do that sometimes people will do is sort of they'll send a response down and then they may do some background work afterwards. They may sort of like, you know, do some additional processing sort of on their own time. Like they're like, hey, user, you know, take this data, like we're done with our response, but I want to go ahead and perform some extra things, right? So for instance, like let me give you an example of that. Let's say that you create a repository on GitHub, right? Or sorry, you fork a repository on GitHub. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but when you click the fork button, you know, to fork a repository, there'll be this little like symbol that comes up that's sort of like, hey, you know, like give us a few minutes, we're like forking this repository, right? So it's sort of like a little loading screen that comes up that says, hey, we're working on it. Okay, maybe I can go ahead and do that for you now. Here's Mongo I Mini. I'm going to fork this repository. I'm going to fork it to my account. And you'll see, hey, it should only take a few seconds. Notice how this request is already returned. Like I've already loaded the page for this, you know, this GitHub page. But it's telling me that like, hey, I'm working on forking the repository. Basically, that's a background job. It's the idea that like, hey, I just loaded a page. You know, I like GitHub basically sent back a response. They're like, hey, we're working on it. And then in the background, they did a bunch of other stuff. But they already sent back the response. Okay, they sent back the response to me immediately to tell me that they're working on it. Then they worked on it in the background. So if I wanted to do other background work, I could do it right here. You know, like I could do some extra computations right here because I've already sent the response out. Like this is basically a way of me deferring the computation so the user doesn't have to wait for them, right? The nice part is the user gets the response immediately, and then I do all my other stuff on my own time. Okay. Yeah, so again, another way of doing this exact same thing is to just return right here and then put JSON to users right here, right? They're the exact same thing. This just returns after I enter the if body. This is just an explicit way of saying, hey, if there's an error, do this, otherwise do this. They're the exact same thing, okay? So you can have a return here and you can remove the else, or you can keep the else and you don't need to return. If you didn't use the return and there's no else, then you have a problem. If you did this, there's a problem, because if there is an error, it's going to try to send an error and then it's going to try to send the users. So you're going to try to send two responses, and you'll see an error in your console that's like, you know, cannot resend headers because you're trying to send two responses. It doesn't make sense. Like you've already finished sending your response from these two lines. Like you should not be trying to send a new response. So this is wrong, but with the else statement, it's fine. With the return inside the if body, it's also fine. The responses of JSON and/or status are side effects of the function. No return value is required in this instance. Yeah, so when I call res.status or res.json, I'm actually affecting the response, right? I'm setting the status, or I'm setting, in this case, I'm sending down the error. So these do incur side effects, and that's why if I call res.json twice, that's actually bad, because I'm trying to send two responses down. Okay, cool. Hopefully that's clear. So let's go ahead and move on to the next route. Right, and that's going to be server.post/users. Recres. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at this one. So post/users, the route should save a new user to the server. Okay, again, it doesn't really tell you what parameters the route should take in, but for the most part, because our users in this case have a username and an age, we're going to accept two parameters, the username and the age, and then save a user with that information. Right. So how do we do that? Well, it's a post request, which means the parameters should be inside the request body. So rec.body is going to contain our two parameters, right? So this is going to contain the username and the age, right? And then we should perform some validation surrounding these, okay? So some validation surrounding them, like, you know, if not username, right? If there's no username provided, then we can do res.status, status user error, res.json, and then this time we'll have to provide an error message. So we can say, you know, must provide a username, right? And then I'm just gonna send back an empty object right here. I just want to check whether this works, right? And of course we include the return as well because if there's no username, we send back an error, and then we're done. Okay, we don't want to continue down. And this is in the case where we have success right now. So I'm just gonna first confirm that this works really quick, and I want to show you that. Okay, so if I do, I'm gonna go ahead and create a new tab. Localhost 3000/users, post, right? So post localhost 3000/users. I go into the body section, click on raw, click on JSON because we're going to send a body that is in JSON format. And then, I'm going to go ahead and specify my body. But first, I'm just going to send this with no body. And you'll see that it says must provide a username. Now I send it with a username Karthik. Right, let's go ahead and send that. Okay. So we get an empty object, perfect. So it actually entered here. So we successfully validated the request thus far, right? So just like we have a username, we also have to do this for age, right? If not age, just indicted error, must provide an age. Okay, you'll notice okay, so the reason I wanted to talk about this briefly is that you'll notice that this is a bit tedious, right? So now it says must provide an age. You'll notice that if I have like a ton of fields, like this is gonna get pretty tedious. And in fact, really for good validation, you wanna be doing more than just checking if the value is provided, right? Username could be provided, but what if hypothetically username was an integer? Or what if username was a Boolean, okay? Or what if username was an array, right? Username, like the type of username, I'm not checking that username is a string. Okay, that's actually an important check too, because the client can send whatever they want. They can send me an array, they can send me a Boolean, they can send me really whatever they want, right? They can send me an object. So in reality, this validation is going to be a little bit more verbose than this as well. And Ryan's going to talk about this too. But one way we can actually improve the validation is to actually let Mongoose handle some of the work for us. Okay, so now I'm going to go back and visit the user.js file. You didn't actually have to do any of this, by the way, for the actual assignment. Just doing the manual validation like this would have been fine. But I want to show you this because it's going to become relevant in the future, and it's just generally good to have some library that sort of handles this for you, right? So remember how I told you earlier, this is the same thing, right? Putting string as the value is the same as specifying type string, right? The reason why you might want to specify the object is you want to add additional parameters, okay? So in this case, I'm going to also add the parameter required true, meaning that, hey, there must be a username, okay? And Mongoose already knows that this username should be of type string, okay? So now let's go ahead and do the same for age, right? So age is going to be type number, and it's also required true. In my case, I say that the user should both have a name or a username and an age. Okay, so I'm just going to add required true. Again, it's just saying, hey, this field must always be provided. Okay, so now what I can do is let me just comment out all of this validation real quick, and I'm going to let Mongoose handle it for us. Okay, so basically, I want to create a new user. How do I create a new user? Well, I have to call new user, and then I have to pass in an object representing that user, right? So I'm going to pass in username, age. Okay, so I'm going to pass in an object representing that user. Okay, so that's going to be my const user. Okay, and now I want to save that user. So I'm going to call user.save, and save accepts a callback, right? The callback is going to take in an error. Okay, so if there's an error, right, I'm going to go ahead and send back that error just like I did before. So status user error, res.json error, and then I'm going to go ahead and return. Okay. And then I'm going to go ahead and send down my user. So res.json user. Okay. Again, actually, maybe to be consistent with what I did earlier, this is the exact same as else res.json user. Okay. Exact same thing. Does that code make sense to everyone? I'm going to explain the validation in 1 second, but does this so far make sense to everyone? Okay, great. So yeah, just like Ryan said in chat, like the idea is that we're going to let Mongoose handle the validation for us. So I commented out all of this validation, but the thing is Mongoose is going to just go ahead and tell us if there was an actual error, right? Because I'm not allowed to save a user if there is no username, if there is no age, because of the two required validations that I specified, right? So I said that, hey, username is required and it must be a string. Age is required and it must be a number. I told Mongoose that. Mongoose is going to validate that, and if it's not validated, it's going to give me an error. So let's go ahead and try that out. So I'm just going to provide no post body, send. There we go. And you'll notice, like look at this, look at this. Look at this beautiful error right here. Errors, age, path age is required, validator error, properties required. This is just like a bunch of extra information about it. But you can see a bunch of like metadata about it. But you can clearly see it's a validation error, path age is required. Another validation error, path username is required. Validation error, right? There we go. And overall, we can see the full message right here as well with both of the validations. So it just gave us this huge object, and we just did no work, right? I literally did not write anything. In fact, I deleted code, right? I just deleted code. I specified a few other things in my file, in my models file, and then we're done. Okay, so that's the key here. Like you want to avoid a bunch of manual work whenever you can, and Mongoose right here really helps you out with that. So let me go ahead and try something. I'm actually not 100% sure how it responds, but it should basically tell me that this is the wrong type. So let's say I specify like username 13, right, which is the wrong type. Let's go ahead and send. Okay, maybe it's first validating all of the required. So let me go ahead and give it an age 15. So there's one of two things it might do here. Okay, yeah. So what it did here was it actually coerced username into a string. Okay, so username is 13 right here. It assumed that the user meant that they wanted a string 13, and so it coerced it into a string. So that's what Mongoose chose to do here. I mean, the other what you could do is if you wanted to be more strict, and personally the route that I prefer is that they could have explicitly had an error. They're saying, hey, username is an integer. I wanted a string, right? Both ways have their merits to a certain degree. But that's what Mongoose chose to do in this case. Okay, cool. Pass string to age, yeah. So there's two options. It's going to convert it. It can either convert it into something. You have to try converting into an integer, or it could give me an error. Okay, cool. So because I said something, it said cast number failed for value something at path age, which is excellent. It basically said, hey, can't figure out what something is. If I were to do like 5, I think it's going to actually cast this. Yeah, so you can see it successfully saved age 5 in this case, even though this was a string 5. So it does try casting all the time, but it lets you know when the casting fails. Okay, cool. All right, that sounds good. Now that we have that working, so that's the entire post endpoint. Notice how short it is because of the Mongoose validations. We don't have to worry about that anymore. So now what we're going to do is move on to the next route, right? Oh, actually, before I move on to the next route, now that we have post working, let's go ahead and make sure that our get works, right? We just created, I think, 3 users, something like that. Let's go ahead and check if our get works. Okay, great. So we have 2 users. We have username 13, age 15, username 13, age 5, right? So those are the 2 users we created. Let me just create a completely valid one for, Sally, who's age 50, and let me send that. Okay, then we'll go ahead and rerun our get, and there we go, Sally, age 50. Okay, so our get is successfully returning to us the different users. You can see this one has a different age than this one as well. But basically, we have all our different users right here that are being successfully returned by get. Any questions about any of that code so far? So min-max validations, yeah. So you can have different validations for different fields. Just like I had required true, you can have different validations. I'm not going to go through all the validations right now, but Ryan is definitely going to talk about some of the main validations when he discusses, in the lecture today. So I just talked about required true. There are various other validations. Yeah, no. That's great, Alon. Yeah, I mean it's but those are definitely some even stronger validations, and Ryan's going to address more of those. It's really useful to know all the different validations, but that wasn't the goal of this solutions lecture. I just wanted to give you a brief overview of it. Okay, cool. So that's that. All right, so now let's go ahead and address the next route, right? The next route in this case is get user's ID. So this route will return the user with a matching ID property, okay? So I'm gonna put that next to get, so server.get, the original get endpoint. So get user's ID, right? So this is a URL parameter. It's not a query string parameter, it's like a parameter embedded within the URL. So that's the distinction here, that's why we do :ID, okay? This basically means, hey, whatever comes after this slash, that's like sort of a placeholder, right? Call that placeholder ID, whatever's there, give it to me I can access that placeholder inside the callback. I'll show you how to do that in just a second. So rec_res, right? And to access that ID, we do rec.params, right? So rec.params is an object, and I'm just accessing the ID directly out of that object, okay? And then what I want to do is I want to find the user by that ID. So I can do find by ID. And the other way I can do it, I can do user.find_ID is ID. Mongo keeps IDs as _ID, so you're going to have to do it this way, I believe. I'm not sure if Mongoose actually corrects that. It could potentially correct the regular ID as well. But find by ID is just another way of doing it where you don't have to pass an object. You just pass the ID directly. Okay, and this is going to be error and the user that we found. And again, we sort of repeat what we had before, right? If error, res.status, status user error, res.json error, else res.json users, or user, right? So I'm almost copy pasting exactly this, except the distinction is that instead of users, it's just an individual user, okay? Does that make sense to everyone? Let me go ahead and try this out so we can see these are the different IDs. First off, let me try some invalid ID. Let me try like ASDF. Cool, cast to object ID failed for value ASDF and path ID for model users. So basically, like when I tried to find a user by the ID ASDF, that was an invalid object ID. It wasn't actually an ID. It wasn't a valid Mongo ID. Hence, we get this error. This is what was reported from these two lines right here. Okay, we see 422 as well. So let me quickly use one of the actual IDs, like this one right here. Go ahead and send that, and there we go. We find that person. Username is string13, age is 5. Okay, we can actually get this one, which is a little bit more legitimate. So we have Sally, age 50. Does that make sense to everyone? Any questions about that specific about get user's ID? Cool. One thing, I just want to show you guys a little bit of decomposition. This might help out a little bit later as well, but you'll notice that these two look very, very similar, right? Sort of like user.find by ID. Honestly, like all of this is exactly the same for both of them. There are various ways that you could decompose this. One is that I could just create a callback that does this. Okay, but I actually want to show you a slightly different way of doing it. So what we could do is we could basically just say, I'm going to call it query and return. Okay, so it's going to take in a query, and it's going to go ahead and return the result of that query, or return an error, or query. Actually, maybe query and respond would be better to be clear. So it's going to execute a query, and it's going to go ahead and if there's an error, it's going to send that error back down to the client. Otherwise, it's going to respond with the result of that query. Okay, so what I can do is I can call query.exec. Okay, so this is a function that we haven't seen before. But basically, anytime I do like user.find like this, or I do user.find.sort, there's a lot of chaining that you can do here in order to build up a query and to do different things with a query. Ryan's going to show you a lot more of this in his lecture. This returns, if I don't specify like the second argument to find, the second callback, what this returns is like a special query object from Mongoose. And that query object has an exec method on it. An exec basically means, hey, take the query object you've built so far and go ahead and actually execute it. Okay, this is sort of like a little bit of a shorthand where I'm just passing the callback in directly. So this is saying to Mongoose, hey, this is the end of my query, execute it. But sometimes if I want to chain extra operations, like if I want to find some records and then I want to sort them in some way, this is lazy. Like Mongoose isn't going to execute this query until you're done with all the chains, until you basically specify exactly what the query should be. Like all the additional things you're doing, right? And there's a lot of different ways to query. Again, Ryan's going to go over a lot of that. But I can do query.exec. Okay, and then that's going to have an error and a result, right? I don't know what the result is, but it's like whatever this query returns. If there's an error, I can just basically just copy paste this code now. So if there's an error, res.status status user error, return the error. Otherwise, return the result. Right. So I'm just basically decomposing it. And so now what I can do is I can just write query and respond user.find res. Just like that, okay? And that is going to do everything that I did before. And the nice part is this can work for more complicated queries. So if I did want to perform a sort afterwards, I can go ahead and do that. This will return the query object, and then boom, we're good to go, right? It doesn't just work for find, it works for all sorts of more complicated queries as well that we want to chain and create. So let's go ahead and just confirm that that works. I fetch the users. That still looks good. Now let me go ahead and fix this. Query and respond. User.find by ID. ID. Okay. And I also have to pass in res. Okay, and there we go. That works as well. So we're good to go there. Does that make sense? By chain, you mean I could async call this? No, whenever I say the word chain, I mean you're chaining function calls. So user.find.sort, for instance, will let you sort the set of users based on some specific field. I'm not going to talk about the format of this. Ryan will explain that in his next lecture. But basically, I can chain a lot of different method calls here. Maybe I can do .count to get the count of the users. I can chain a lot of method calls here in some way in order to perform more complicated queries. And so that's what I mean by chain. I'm chaining different function calls together. Yeah, exactly. Sorry, yeah. So you did mention function calls chains. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Cool. Never thought to do that. Awesome decomposition. Okay, awesome. Yeah, cool. Yeah, so this is, again, this is just a way to sort of help you out so you don't have to repeat yourself. And, for this last one, it's a bit different, right? If we're doing a .save, we're not actually, this is not a read query. We're not reading something. So the callback is only accepting one parameter, which is just the error right now. So hence, so this is not actually going to work. We can't decompose it for this right here. We can't decompose this right here to use query and respond, but that's okay. That's okay. The point is we simplified both of these, which is nice. All right. Finally, the last path is delete users, right? Delete users ID. So this route should delete the specified user. Let's go ahead and implement that. So again, rect.params is going to contain the named parameters. This is in contrast to rect.query, right? Rect.query contains all parameters in the query string. Rect.params contains the parameters within the URL. So anything that's prefixed by a colon. So colon ID is a URL parameter, an embedded URL parameter. That's what rect.params gives us. Now that we have the ID, we want to go ahead and remove that user. I'm actually forgetting, is it remove or delete? I always forget the distinction between these two. Mongoose remove, I think it's remove. Mongoose API. Yeah, it's document, embedded document.remove. Yeah, it looks like it's remove, query remove. There you go. Okay. So in this case, what I can do is, I want to go ahead and remove user.remove where the ID is that ID. So, I believe there, if I check, there's probably a remove by ID, or is there not? Remove by ID. Oh, maybe we need to specify it explicitly. That's fine. So remove, again, I want to specify that the ID is this ID right here, right? So I'm just saying, hey, remove all documents where the ID is the ID that are provided. Again, Mongo represents it as underscore ID. I don't remember off the top of my head whether you can sort of just use ID and Mongoose will implicitly convert for you or not. But I'm going to use underscore ID for now, and we can check that real quick. So user.remove. And then, let's go ahead and confirm that works, right? So if there's an error, then we're going to do status user error. Okay, res.json error. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and send down response. We're going to send down maybe just success true in this case. We're not really sending down any meaningful data. We're just saying, hey, we're good to go, right? So let's go ahead and try that just to make sure that works. So we have Postman. Let's go ahead and just make another GET request to /users again. We see this user right here. I want to delete that one. So delete request to localhost 3000 /users /that ID. Send that. Okay, cool. We got back success true. So that looked like it worked. Let's confirm. So there's 3 users right now. Let's make sure there are 2. So we want to get rid of this one with username 13 age 5. Okay, so we have username 13 age 15. That was the old one that was still there. We got rid of that middle one. So we're good to go. Okay, so that successfully worked. Let me go ahead and just try to change this to regular ID and see if that works. I don't know for sure. Let me try this again. Okay, let's try to delete this one. Okay, send. Okay, cool. Okay, so Mongoose actually fixes that up for it. Wait, no, it doesn't. Okay, yeah. All right, so we have to be careful. Yeah, so again, Mongoose is trying to look for a regular ID field, not underscore ID. It's trying to look for a regular ID field that matches ID. Unfortunately, no document has that. The documents only have underscore ID, okay? So we do, in fact, need underscore ID here. So again, just to recap about that, Mongo represents the ID field, the key of the ID field is actually underscore ID. It's not ID. Okay, I don't know why they decided to do that. I personally would have preferred ID. They decided to add an underscore ID. So whenever you're trying to filter by it, like this, always make sure you're writing underscore ID, okay? If you're using like the find by ID or something, if you're using a specific method, in this case, find by ID, this is clear that it wants you to find by like underscore ID. That's a Mongoose method that implicitly does that for you, right? So find by ID is sort of exactly the same as like find one where, you know, underscore ID is ID, okay? That's like exactly the same as that, okay? Excellent. So again, find returns all documents that match a query. Find one returns the first document that matches that query. So that's the distinction between the two. Cool. So we have to specify like this. So again, just to recap, this right here. Let me go ahead and try to delete that. Oops. Success true. Let's go ahead and yep, that looks solid. That looks solid. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, find by ID and remove. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, this is a good point. Yeah. Let me just go ahead and address Pat's question real quick. What do you mean by decompose? So decompose, it's just a word that means like, how do I sort of take common functionality that I see in multiple areas and make a function that does that all for me? So basically, it's a way to prevent me from copy pasting code, right? You'll notice that basically this piece of code, if error, res.status, status user error, you know, res.json error, res.json result, it was repeated in both this handler right here and in this handler. By creating a function that did it for me, so like this function right here, I was able to basically decompose out that functionality. I was able to take that functionality from those two places, consolidate it into one place, you know, lines 11 through 20, and just call it twice. Okay, so I decomposed it out. I prevented myself from repeating myself. So it's just a way to, you know, break up your code into functions to reuse a lot of different pieces of code, right? To reuse some of that code to prevent repetition. Okay, so yeah, so let's address some of these. So I want to go ahead and address the first one, which is that, or address something important, which you guys saw it, but basically, if I were to delete something, you know, if I were to delete some ID, like this ID right here, 5994BC, I've already deleted that, right? The one that's here is 5994BD, okay? So it starts with 4BD. This has 4BC, so this is the old one that I already deleted. If I send this again, it'll still tell me that it's succeeding, okay? And I'll still only have this one record left. That's because remove is indeed succeeding. Like basically it's removing, but nothing matches this condition right here. Nothing matches it. So what it's basically saying is like, hey, I did remove stuff. There was nothing to remove, but you know, I did succeed. Like this query successfully executed. You know, that right there is not what we want. What we want is to actually remove. Like the reason that we don't want that is we want to be explicit to the user, right? If the user gave us a bad ID, we want to say that it's a bad ID in some way. Okay. So there are various ways to do that. I want to first try out a method that was mentioned here. I think Julian mentioned find by ID and remove. Let me go ahead and try that. Find by ID and remove. All right. So in this case, I would just have to pass in the regular ID. Okay. And then let me try this. Okay, so that still says success true, so I'm guessing that's not actually checking it either, right? So that's not really checking either. Okay, so if I really want to have like sort of better validation here, what I can do is do user.findById, okay? And I can do, you know, ID in this case, or actually, wait. Actually, I want to quickly look at the docs for find by ID and remove. Just give me 1 second. If find by ID and remove actually gives me the user itself, I can go ahead and confirm that. Here we go. Issue equivalent find and modify. Callback is a function. Okay. finds a matching document, removes it, passing the found document, if any, to the callback. Okay, this is the key. Passing the found document, if any, to the callback, okay? So the point here is that what I can do is, inside this callback, I'm actually going to get back the specific user, okay? So if there was an error, I should still report it. That means just, we couldn't run the query for some reason. Else, if there's no user, okay, that basically means that, hey, there was no user in the first place. So now I can send an error. I can say res.status, status user error, res.json error, must provide a valid ID. Okay, so just to recap, it gives me back the actual user that's removing. That's what this line means. Passing the found document, if any, to the callback. Okay, so it's giving back that user. If there is no user, if it's null, that means that, hey, I couldn't even find a user in the first place, so you must provide a valid ID. Otherwise, success true. So let's go ahead and try that. So I send. There we go. Must provide a valid ID. That's what I wanted to see. So now let me try to delete Sally here. Success true. Beautiful. Beautiful. So now I can go ahead and just rerun this. I'll get an empty array. Excellent. All right. Okay. So another way to have done this, if you didn't know about find by ID and remove, is you could have just done a regular find by ID, and just checked if it existed. So just like we did, up here, I could just run this query individually, make sure that I get a user back, and then call remove or find by ID and remove. Okay. So that's another way of doing the same thing. And if I couldn't find the user in the first step, I could report an error. This is a shorthand. Mongoose provides various sort of helper functions like this that will help you out. Cool. Yeah, hopefully, I sort of just explained trying to delete a record which has just been deleted. Better to get used to Mongo or Mongoose first. I mean, the thing is, you're going to be using Mongoose all the time to interface with Mongo, so I would just get used to the Mongoose API. Like, there might be some times when you need to go back down and issue raw queries, but for the most part, Mongoose wraps everything you need to do, right? So this like find by ID and remove, find by ID, find, like all of these, just like if you get used to them, you'll just be using them all the time. So I really don't think that you need to, I think that you should just stick with Mongoose as much as you can. If there is some case that Mongoose doesn't handle, I would be surprised by that. Honestly, I think Mongoose handles almost all cases I've ever needed to do. Then you can fall back to regular Mongo, like regular Mongo queries, but you don't have to worry about that otherwise. Mongoose is actually providing an API that's very similar to Mongo. It's just like very slight differences. They're like slight sort of naming and or slight sort of like there's just very small differences between the two queries. When you execute them, it just looks slightly different. So it's not really giving you a huge abstraction layer or something. It's not doing a ton for you. So you do have like almost all the power you would with regular Mongo queries. But yeah, if you don't understand what I just said, don't worry about that. Basically, just stick to using the same Mongoose methods you've had all the time. All right, I think that's it actually. Is there anything else that I wanted to talk about? No, I think I've covered everything I wanted to discuss. Are there any questions about any of that? So again, just to recap some of the main things, some of the main new things I'm going to recap, which is one, the idea that you can put validation inside the model, right? So I had my user model and I had validation inside here, and Mongoose, basically validated for me. So I created a new user, and then I had that user validated by calling .save, right? This error handler handled any validation errors because I specified all of them right here. So that's going to be important going forward. Using .exec is going to be important going forward. Exec, just a way to execute a query. And because I didn't pass in a second argument right here, this basically returns a query object, which I can then call exec on. And I can chain different methods in order to form more complex queries, which you'll see a lot in Ryan's lecture. Post the code and video, please. I'd like to read it back. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, one last thing is, I want to show you guys something. So lines 32 and 33, right? I have username age right here. I extract out username age from request.body, and then I pass in username age into new user. You might think, hey, why don't you just do rec.body? Okay, like you can get rid of this line, right? Why don't I just do that? There's a specific reason it looks like this. It's subtle, but it's for security. Okay, so the idea is oftentimes you'll have some fields which are automatically computed for you. Okay, like let me give you an example. Like created at, for instance. Created at is a field that you'll see in a few cases, and what that does is it's usually automatically set for you, right? It's set to like the time that this record was created. Okay, so if you pass rec.body in directly, what you're basically saying is, hey, user, you can provide me whatever fields you want. Everything inside rec.body I'm going to use to create a new user. So hypothetically, the user could pass you a created at. They could give you a created at field and could just specify the created at for the user. So they can modify the field even though they're not supposed to, because rec.body contains whatever parameters that user provided to you, right? Rec.body is all the parameters the user provided, okay? So in this way, you're sort of letting them set any field they want in the user model, okay? Which may or may not be what you want to do, and usually it's actually not. It's usually better to be explicit, right? Better to be explicit about the exact fields you're passing in, right? Let me give you another example why that could be useful. Let's say I have a third field status, for instance, right? Status is you know, like a type, you know, like maybe I give it a type string or something. Okay, I don't know what this is, but I have some field status. Let's say that only an administrator can set the status, right? So that's so basically, if only an administrator can set the status, I don't want the user to be able to modify that here, right? If I pass in rec.body, I'm giving the user the ability to set that, and I don't want them to be able to set that, right? I only want status to be set by an administrator. Okay. So that's why, like, again, it's just, you're just limiting the scope. You're making sure that only the fields you care about are being set. It's usually good to always be explicit like this. Don't pass rec.body into a new user constructor or a new model constructor. Always be really careful. Always extract out exactly the parameters you want. That honestly will save you probably a lot of security issues. Okay. So this is really the way to do it. Do not pass in rec.body into arbitrary places. It's pretty dangerous. Okay. Be very careful with how you use rec.body. Yeah, I could also just do like rec.body.username, right? Like this if I wanted to, instead of doing this first, but I just sort of like how this looks. I like the shorthand a little bit more here. All right, any other questions about that before we wrap up? Okay, great. Well, you know, thanks a lot, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and wait for this video to finish processing, and then I'll upload it. You know, if you have any further questions, definitely don't hesitate to ask on the CS1 or CS1 Help channel, and we'll get to you. Yeah, thanks a lot.